Chapter 8. Winter on the Porcupine. The season of trapping had come. Hunters had secured their legal game and gone back to the towns. Fur, prime now and at the height of its value, was a lure to the hardy Indian and to the adventurous old-timer such as Jim Horner. They took the trails into the remotest corners of the forest, built rude shelters of logs, skin, and canvas, dug their last year's steel traps out of hiding places, and constructed temporary new traps in the form of deadfalls and snares. Regardless of snow, ice, and temperatures below zero, there was smoke in the valleys, and there were tracks of snowshoe or moccasin in all the principal river bottoms. The trapper's most valued game was black or silver fox, then the marten, keen-scented relative of the Russian sable. This fur-bearer lived for the most part in the dense spruce forests, and besides chasing rabbits, climbed about the trees in pursuit of the red squirrels. The marten's water-loving cousin, the mink, was next in importance, for beaver were protected by law, and otter and fisher had become almost extinct. Wolverine, largest of the weasel tribe, showing by its stripes how closely it is related to the lowly skunk, ranked high, and the heavily furred but scarce Canada lynx was much sought. Next came the red foxes, then the wolves and the coyotes, whose skins made fine robes. The bounty on wolves made them especially desirable, but they were so big and powerful as well as wise that they were considered the most difficult of all the furred game to trap, and so were not followed by some of the less experienced men unless there was good prospect of a rifle shot. The trappers likewise secured ermine, the white winter phase of brown little northern weasels. They killed for food the snowshoe rabbit, the red squirrel, and sometimes the porcupine. Also they shot or snared grouse and ptarmigan, and caught a few trout where warm springs kept the pools from freezing. Theirs was a hard but interesting life where fur was plentiful. Old Jim turned trapper in November, and as luck would have it, he secured trapping rights in the upper reaches of the Porcupine. For a week or two he worked on marten and mink, catching 2 of each. Then he became increasingly aware of Brown Chest's pack and their work both up and down the valley. He had one glimpse of the wolves. On a very wintry day when the trees were bending under a fresh load of snow, he came along the trap line just in time to see several dark-colored animals drinking at the edge of a cliff where a spring kept the water from freezing. Pulling out his binoculars, he soon found that they were big wolves. As he watched, the brown-chested leader circled the pool and began to cross the river on the ice. A black wolf followed him, then a brown, then 2 more blacks. The next was iron-gray in color. Last came 2 blacks. The smaller of these 2 limped. Jim looked hard and guessed rightly that this was the mate of Old Gray. Then he turned his glasses upon the wolf at the tail of the column. Because it had followed Blackie, he felt sure that this must be the pup which had escaped from him at the den. He was mightily interested in seeing how it had developed. Already it had shaken off all puppy awkwardness, and though thin, was bigger than the other wolves. Also, Jim noticed that while the others followed each other with scarcely a glance to right or left, the big pup was very much on the alert and constantly looking about him. Jim was more than 1/4 of a mile away, but in the open. He kicked out sideways with his right foot. The result was just what he expected, for the pup instantly saw the motion and stopped in his tracks to study the distant figure. Suddenly then, the young wolf lunged forward, striking his mother's flank as he passed her, thus alarming her and the others one after another. In a moment, he was carrying the whole pack away with him in a fast run toward the dense timber. The old man watched them as long as they were in sight. In the snow they made long leaps, trying as much as possible to land in each other's tracks. Jim knew the strength back of those bounds and the killing power of a great pack like this. No animal in the mountains could withstand them, unless perhaps the old grizzlies. Man alone might dare stand in the way of 8 hungry wolves when, full of the hunting fever, they would go roaring down the valley of the Porcupine, or gallop silently along the trails with death for some luckless creature written in every grim movement of those supple bodies and determined jaws. Jim lit a cigarette and meditated. With any luck, he might be able to catch every one of this pack. It would represent a lot of money in skins and bounty, more perhaps than might be secured by months of work with smaller fur-bearers. Anyway, he argued, it was good for the country to thin out the wolves. It was a help to the ranchmen and to gunners and their guides. Besides that, there was a shortage of other fur-bearers, and it was depleting the breeding stock to catch too many of the few that were left. In the end, he determined to concentrate on getting the wolves. Before these young ones get educated, especially that pup of old Gray, he ended to himself. And after this, I'll carry a rifle. He walked down the edge of the stream to have a look at the tracks. There were 2 that equaled the size of a Great Dane's. These Jim examined very carefully. One belonged to Brown Chest. The other, he felt sure, was made by the big pup, and the pup's was the larger of the 2. The old man shook his head grimly. He was thinking of the harm he had done the country in letting a great wolf like this slip through his fingers when it was only an innocent, woolly little pup. Old Gray had ruled for 12 or more years. His mate Blackie had lived for 8 or 10 and was still eluding man. Not only did the black pup have the best wolf blood in his veins, but he was under the leadership now of another renowned old warrior. If I don't get him quick, mused Jim, it'll take the whole world a dozen years to round him up. He'll have his own pack before 2 seasons at most, and then there'll be fun around here, I bet. But, he added, I'll get him. Slowly, he followed the back tracks of the pack to see where they had come from that morning. Straight up the valley, then left. Across an open flat, then right. Into the willows at a bend of the river. Then Jim stopped. The snow was trampled and bloody. A yearling moose, or what was left of it, lay there in the shadow of a spruce. 2 Canada jays pecked at the carcass, then flew into the spruce to hide the shreds of meat they had secured. The red squirrels were running from tree to tree as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. What a bait that'll make, thought Jim. Then he looked at the trail of his snowshoes and remembered that the pack had been frightened and would be on its guard. Before hunting again in this section of the valley, the wolves would circle and study the country until they made very sure no man was about. At the head of the carcass, several particularly large footprints caught Jim's eye. He stooped to measure them with the palm of his hand. I'll get him, he muttered, but the 2 jays were screaming derisively.